When each of my daughters turned 13 years old, I had a conversation with them. And it was really based around what to look for in a husband, years and years later, of course. And I asked them to do something. I asked them to identify men in their lives that they had regular contact with, that they respected, and to watch them and actually kind of study them a little bit. The intent being, I wanted them to identify the character traits and the values of those men that they respected, what garnered that respect in them for these men. And the reason I wanted them to do that is because I wanted them to spend years of meditation on this, so when it came to time to choose a husband, they weren't so enamored by a handsome face or a flashy car, but they had something more meaningful rooted in their minds and in their hearts for what to look for. Today is a continuation of that conversation with my daughters. They don't know that yet, but here we go. Today I'm going to get a little more specific and really talk about the character traits that make a good father for their future children. The first criteria for a good father is that he has to be a father. He has to have at least one child. That's just built into the definition, right? A good father has to be a father. Not immediately, but eventually. So girls, if he doesn't want to provide your father with grandchildren sometime in the future, just move him right along. The second criteria for a good father, he has to be good. The third criteria for a good father is that he must love the mother of his children. This was illustrated to me very well when I was a teenager. I spent a lot of time at my friend Brendan's house. Now, my parents were divorced when I was a year old, and as a result, I didn't have the opportunity to see the interactions between a husband and wife in my home. It just wasn't there. I shared custody, lived with my mom every other weekend, holidays with my dad. So I didn't have a chance to look and see mom and dad and how they related to each other. I don't think Brendan knows this, but one of the draws for me to spending time at his house rather than at our place was that I got to observe Richard and Lana in their interactions. And I was there often, and I got to be there in times of celebration. I got to be there when times were a little rough. I might have contributed to some of those rougher times, like when I cracked my head open and bled all over their carpet. But I got to see them in all different phases of life and all different aspects of their relationship, and I got to see how they interacted with each other. Now, Richard and Lana had pet names for each other, like we all do, and the second most common I think I heard was Richard would call Lana Sweetie. But the bread and butter, the most common names that they had for each other were his and hers. And I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that the reason or the way they came up with the his and hers comes out of Song of Solomon, chapter 6. And the concept of, I am my beloved's and he is mine. That mutual submission to one another. That utter giving of yourself to someone else. As an adult, I spent some time with a couple from this church. They've graduated from life now, but they were in their 90s at the time. And I remember asking Don, what's your favorite cookie? I was planning on making a plate of cookies and bringing it over with my next visit. And Don responded, Barbara's favorite cookie is a simple, plain sugar cookie. No frosting, just a simple sugar cookie. And in that really simple interaction, I saw something I didn't expect. And Don was in his 90s, but he was still sharp as a tack. And I honestly don't think he realized that he didn't answer my question. Because I didn't ask him what Barbara's favorite cookie was. I asked him what his favorite cookie was. And his answer was so fluid and immediate and casual. And it spoke to me of years, decades of looking more to the needs of his wife than to his own. That it wasn't second nature anymore, it was first nature. That's just who he was. I don't know if Don knew what his favorite cookie was. It was clear that it was irrelevant. He got more joy and satisfaction from just the thought and the twinkle in his eye when he gave that answer of just seeing his wife and thinking of his wife enjoying a cookie. He got more joy out of that than anything that crossed his taste buds. It was clear. And I saw this not just in Don, I saw it in Barbara too. We would be doing projects at their house and we'd say, Barbara, what do you want us to do here? And she'd say, well, Don would want this. And you ask Don, what do you want us to do here? And you say, well, Barbara would want that. It was just inherent in their relationship. And in both Brendan's house and at Don and Barbara's, the best gift that they could have ever given their children was those fathers. It was the love they had for their wives. Paul talks about this in Ephesians 5. He said, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That simple statement wipes out every excuse that you have for not honoring and respecting and cherishing your wife. The example that Jesus gave, he laid down his life. He sacrificed his life for the church. And he said, that is how you're supposed to approach your relationship with your wife. No preconditions, no excuses. Everything is sacrificed. And in a home where that is true, those children are safe and secure and sound. As I was putting this together, I came across a couple of realizations. One of those is the realization that you cannot truly love those you attempt to control. The other is you cannot truly love those you refuse to influence. I put together an analogy that we're going to use today, and that's fatherhood is navigating a canoe down a river. But instead of land on either sides of the river, you have waterfalls that drop off into oblivion. And to represent one side of land, what would be land, one of those waterfalls is tyranny. And that's the approach that some fathers gravitate towards when things aren't going their way. My way or the highway, you'll do it or else kind of approach. On the other side, the other waterfall is apathy. You cannot truly love those you refuse to influence. This is where neglect and abandonment come in. And the job of a good father is to navigate that canoe safely down the river. And you have to realize also here that the father is not the only one in that canoe. The decisions that he makes don't just affect himself. It has tremendous impact on the rest of his family. And when it comes to that third criteria that I was talking about a father must love the mother of his children, what that does for him is that puts an oar in the hands of his wife. Because there are going to be obstacles in the river, and it's tough to navigate. And I know there are exceptions, but you will never find a better advocate for your children than their mother as a father. The fourth criteria, girls, the father of your future children needs to be an active parent. I remember my dad taking us on a salmon snagging trip down to Sturgeon Bay, a fishing expedition. I remember him taking us camping at Long Lake, but mostly I remember the baseball games. I played baseball in the City League for 11 years, and my dad didn't make every game, but pretty close. And I can remember, as if it were yesterday, stepping into the batter's box and hearing my dad from the stand saying, "Aaron, choke up," which of course I didn't. Well, I didn't necessarily appreciate the technical advice I was getting from my dad. I remember as a young teen looking at the faces of my teammates and watching them scan the stands looking for their fathers, and just the utter disappointment and the drop in countenance when they couldn't find them. In Deuteronomy 6, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. It's an intentional, focused, make an impression. It needs to stick. It needs to last. And he's talking about the values that are so important. When I'm talking about an active parent, I'm talking about a father who shows up, a father who's present and engaged. And girls, you can see this character in a pre-dad in the way that they conduct themselves, in the way that they are present for their family and their friends and those around them, and the care that they give and the engagement that they have. They're not isolated, they're in community and they're participating. The fifth criteria is a good father must show a strong work ethic, must be a hard worker. My dad was an electrician in the union for 30 years after his service in the Navy. Beyond that, my dad taught himself the trades of pipe bending and welding. He used those skills to make us a homemade go-kart. The frame, the engine, tooled the engine, the steering, the brakes. Okay, the brakes didn't work very well, but the rest of it, I think, was all functional. And he made us a go-kart. He also made us a mini bike. And he made a hoist for his pickup truck. He mounted in the bed of his pickup truck so he could load up big old tractor parts and car transmissions and the like. My point here being, as a young man growing up, I could not look at my father and the example that he laid and find any excuse for laziness. It just wasn't there. Similarly, my mom. And for those single moms that are listening, there's no question about it, you have an extra challenge, because there are a lot of times where you have to step into that role, that fatherly role, to teach your children lessons that they might not otherwise learn. My mom did a great example of that with the work ethic. My sister-in-law asked my mom years and years later how she managed a household of 5 boys by herself. And she said, well, it was pretty easy. She said, I laid out a schedule and broke it into 15-minute increments. And then I just managed each of those pieces of time in a schedule. Easy, right? Anybody else manage their calendar that way? So girls, when you're looking to that future husband, the future father of your children, find someone who's a hard worker, who isn't lazy, not just in the job they get paid to do, but in all aspects of their life. That there's commitment and there's drive and there's attention to detail, that they're putting in the effort. Number 6, a good father must serve beyond the borders of his family. I have to revise this. A great father serves beyond the borders of his family. Like I said, when I was growing up, my parents were divorced and we lived with my mom. So I had a lot of influences beyond my dad and my mom and my brothers. There were a lot of good fathers in the neighborhood, friends, fathers of my friends, fathers in the community. I remember Warren teaching a man in demand class in our local school. Cliff taught a boys brigade class. I remember Steve, who gave my family and I a ride home one night at night, and driving in reverse the whole way. I don't know what lesson I learned, but it was fun. I remember Bob teaching me a lesson in integrity over an ice cream. Lots and lots of men in our community invested in me. And I got to say, a great father serves beyond the borders of his family. In James 1:27, We read, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." I wasn't an orphan, but it wasn't an ideal circumstance as far as learning from an intact family, a father who was there in the house that I lived with on a day-to-day basis. As far as identifying a young man who will serve beyond the borders of his family, I would look to a man who has the character and demonstrates that he works to help those who can never repay what he's investing in them. The kid who's being bullied, standing up for the kid who's being bullied, for the kid who's just a bit awkward and needs somebody to befriend him. That's the kind of character that you'll find that will make a great father for your future children. And the last one, a good father is a humble father. Now, again, back to the analogy of being in the boat. It's really hard to navigate around obstacles that you're unfamiliar with, to teach your children about temptations and trials that you haven't yourself experienced. Now, I learned a lot from being a young man in a really good neighborhood. I also learned from men in this church. I remember in 2007, a couple of the guys in this church approached me and said they needed another male chaperone for a mission trip to Mexico. They were taking a bunch of high schoolers to Mexico to build a house for a family, and they needed one more guy to be there as a chaperone. And I remember my immediate internal reaction was, no way. I've never been to Mexico, my Spanish is lousy, and I don't work with high schoolers. There's just no way. And they approached me Sunday after Sunday and asked me this. I think it was a concentrated team effort. I'm not positive of that. I think there was a nefarious plot there. But through the weeks, I was remembering Cliff and Warren and Bob and Jim and Steve and Bob and what they poured into me, and I wasn't their kid. They were going to get no return from what they invested in me. And it made me realize, from the impact of the men here today, from the impact of the men in my life when I was younger, that I didn't have to be qualified to serve. I just had to step out and do it. So I went to Mexico in 2007. When it comes to a man who is humble, he needs to be able to learn from others so that he can help his family navigate obstacles that he hasn't experienced. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." There are lessons that we as fathers need to learn that we can't draw from our history and apply. A humble father is a father who says, I need help when he needs it, when he's out of his depth. So girls, this is the list. These are the 7 things that I think are key ingredients to what makes a good father for your future children. For those of you who've been listening in, I want to address a few groups. The first one, I want to address the bad fathers. I'm not going to define what a bad father is, but as a bad father, there's something that I think you need to hear today, and that is that you are infinitely loved. Maybe not by your family, maybe not from those who know your deeds, but the God who created everything loves you. It's illustrated really well in Luke 15. It's the story of the prodigal son. And today, if you fit into that category of being a bad father, I want you to put yourself in the position of the son, because this is really who he's talking about. So if you put yourself in that category of being a bad father, please hear this from the perspective of the son. It says, "But while the son was still a long ways off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." The first thing that I want to point out here is, it says, "Well, the son was still a long ways off." His dad saw him. And I don't think it's accidental. I think that is an intentional wording that Jesus put in there. Because if you think about it, how often do you look off in the distance when you're not looking for something specific? I think Jesus put these very words in there to point out that he was hoping for, he was eagerly anticipating, he was rooting for his son to come home. The likelihood that a father is randomly looking off in the distance in the exact position where his son returns is, I think, unlikely. The second thing I'd like to point out is it says that he ran to his son. How many of you have a memory of your father running? Not in sports, not in exercise, but your father running for something. How many of you have a memory of your father running to you so that he could be closer to you just that much faster? I think this speaks to God and how he opens himself up to be vulnerable to us. Going back to that statement, you cannot love those you attempt to control. God had to give us the choice to be able to spit in his face and turn around and walk the other way. Because if he didn't give us that choice, we couldn't therefore choose the other direction and choose to love him. You can't have love where tyranny reigns. And so God left himself vulnerable from the very beginning when he created Adam and Eve and he gave them free will, knowing that he was going to get hurt. That's just who he is. That's what love is. You have to remain vulnerable. You have to be open. Now, he doesn't take your choice away. If you're not coming down that road, he allows you to go the other path. He allows you to stay away. But he removes every excuse that you could ever come up with for not returning. For those of you who put yourself in the bad dad category, and you're sitting there going through your head of, well, you don't know the things that I did, the people I've hurt. I got to say, God is unimpressed with your list. If you think your list can compete with God's love and grace, you're sorely mistaken. The second group of people I'd like to address is those who've had bad fathers or have bad fathers. You need to understand that the father in this story represents what a father really ought to be. A father who is constantly rooting for his child, supporting, giving him the choice, but ultimately always in your corner. If you had or have a bad father, I'm sorry, but what you need to realize is that your earthly father is a poor reflection of God and the love that he has for you. They're completely different worlds. And you need to give up that perspective of your father and any correlation to God. God loves you undeniably. And the last group I want to address is good fathers. Probably every good father is right now looking for an excuse to exclude themselves from this category. Please stop. Thank you.